Have you ever wondered why some people seem to have an almost magical ability to influence those around them without resorting to loud words or persistent requests? They simply take a step back and suddenly everything around them is transformed. The atmosphere changes. People become interested, eager to communicate, and feel the need to respond. Imagine what would happen if you started acting the same way. If instead of reacting instantly to every event, you choose silence. If instead of a violent display of emotion, you choose detachment. What do you think will happen? Herein lies the secret. When you stop being constantly available, emotionally, physically, psychologically, the world around you begins to change. People around you feel confused because they are used to controlling you, manipulating your reactions, using your impulses and predictability. But the moment you decide to detach, the rules of the game change. Those who are sure they knew you suddenly realize that they don't really know anything about you. As Carl Jung once observed, everything that annoys us about others can help us better understand ourselves. Think about this aspect of being human. When you become unattainable, who falls into a state of true despair? Who feels frustrated and annoyed? Who resorts to trying to provoke you in order to elicit the slightest emotional response? These reactions of others reveal much more about them than about you, and mainly demonstrate the extent to which you are still being manipulated, sometimes without you even realizing it. You continue to give of yourself gratuitously in an effort to please others, to maintain a fragile peace, to fear losing people who, in fact, have never been genuinely there for you. And with every forced agreement, every momentary reaction, every emotional outburst, you sacrifice a piece of your life energy. And what is left in the end? Inexhaustible fatigue, bitter disappointment, and oppressive emptiness that is hard to explain rationally. But let me explain the reason for this phenomenon. You are overly available to those who do not deserve even a brief moment of your precious silence. It's not about shutting yourself off from the world, it's about making a conscious choice in favor of yourself. It is about internalizing the concept that the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung called individuation, which is the process of becoming a whole, authentic, and self-sufficient person. And this complex process begins with the realization that silence is sometimes more powerful than 1,000 arguments, and that a temporary retreat, dictated not by the desire to escape from problems, but by a deep awareness of the situation, is an act of true strength. Therefore, addressing everyone who reads these lines, it is worth asking a question that requires an honest answer. How long will a person allow other people's emotions to rule his life? Until when will he be like a puppet, twitching in response to every touch on his vulnerable places? Perhaps it's time to break these invisible threads, detach yourself from other people's influence, and shroud yourself in a veil of mystery. After all, when a person ceases to be an easy prey, everything around him changes. Since childhood, people are taught to be always on the lookout, to respond instantly to requests, to please others and say yes, even when the soul screams no. From a small age, the idea that the value of a person is determined by his or her availability to others is implanted in the consciousness. But here is a bitter truth that few people dare to voice. Excessive accessibility is not a virtue, but a real prison. As long as a person believes that he or she must be available all the time, emotionally, physically, or otherwise, he or she will be manipulated, deplete his or her resources, and ultimately be forgotten as soon as he or she is no longer useful. The reason is simple. Being always on the lookout, a person becomes predictable, and everything predictable sooner or later turns into a tool. In modern society, there is often a tendency to use some people by others as a kind of button to satisfy emotional needs. A person becomes an object to be pressed at moments when attention, consolation, or confirmation of one's own importance is required, and then, having received what is desired, is simply pushed aside until the next time. Often, an individual subjected to such an attitude does not realize what is happening, being in a false confidence that his readiness to always come to the rescue will provide mutual support in a difficult moment. However, as practice shows, such a strategy does not bring the expected results. The famous psychologist Carl Jung, in his work, spoke about persona, a mask that we put on, trying to earn recognition, love, and acceptance in society. It is this mask, according to the scientists, that makes a person excessively accessible to others. He gets used to demonstrating that everything is all right, even when he is in great discomfort, to respond instantly to messages despite fatigue, to constantly explain and justify his actions as if he owes something to the whole world. However, the more a person dissolves into other people's problems and needs, the more he loses touch with himself, with his true wants and needs. Constant availability for others becomes a kind of self-denial, a veiled way of seeking approval and avoiding rejection, an attempt to control the impression he makes on others. But this control is achieved at an exorbitant price, at the cost of one's own mental balance and vital energy, which is used up as if it were an inexhaustible resource, when in fact it is very limited. People who seek your round-the-clock availability, in fact, crave not yourself, but the benefits that you give them: recognition, companionship, the opportunity to distract from worries and emotional support. However, when you change, set personal boundaries, or refuse to respond immediately to their requests, these same people become irritated, accuse you, and label you as weird. The reason is not because of your transformation, but because you are no longer a convenient tool to fulfill their needs. And here it is, the harsh truth of life. The more available you are, the less appreciative you are of those around you. Abundance gets tiresome, and your emotional support becomes commonplace, a kind of emotional rag. No one respects what is effortless, and no one appreciates what is always at hand. Therefore, it is worth stopping and thinking, who is really worthy of your precious time? Who deserves your attention, your presence, and your ability to listen? Or more importantly, who deserves your absence? But before we answer these questions, we need to understand one key thing. Why do we react so painfully to other people's discontent? Why do we give in so easily to outside pressure? In the depths of human nature is hidden almost instinctive desire to explain their actions, to seek justification, and to please others. This phenomenon has its roots in Carl Jung's concept of psychic energy. The next part of the story will be devoted to this very topic because personal energy is a valuable resource, and the ability to protect it from outside encroachment is a vital skill. Carl Jung envisioned the human psyche not as a mindless mechanism that automatically reacts to external stimuli, but as a complex energy system. Every thought, every feeling, and every action requires expenditure of this energy. The main question is, who controls the distribution of this valuable resource? The person himself or the world around him? Every impulsive response, every attempt to defend oneself from unjustified criticism, every attempt to engage in pointless arguments to prove one's rightness, every desire to please those who do not appreciate it, all this leads to an unproductive waste of psychic energy, spending internal forces on things that are of no use. Carl Jung stated unequivocally, "What a person fights hard against tends to take root and persist." The more vigorously an individual reacts to external stimuli, the more he entangles himself in the net of addiction. People living in a state of emotional burnout are not inherently weak, rather they have lost their way. It is known what happens to those who exhaust themselves emotionally. They become defenseless and vulnerable. And when a person is in a vulnerable state, they become easy prey for those around them. Manipulators, opportunists, and people in dire emotional need have the ability to sense this vulnerability. They unmistakably identify those who do not know how to protect their energy, who react to the slightest stimuli and constantly try to change the world around them, and shamelessly take advantage of it. Jung emphasized that a healthy psyche is characterized by the ability to keep energy within one's own system. This involves the ability to say no without feeling guilty, the ability to remain silent without feeling like a coward, and the ability to observe before acting. True strength lies not in impulsive reactions, but in consciously choosing the moment and the way to act. This becomes possible only when one knows oneself well enough to recognize one's own impulses and motives. Surely everyone knows that heavy feeling when sleepless nights become the payback for unspoken words or unresolved conflicts. For hours scrolling through the scenarios of missed opportunities in his head, tormented by questions about the causes of unfair treatment, a person depletes his energy reserve, supporting the existence of ghosts of the past. It is like breathing life into something that should have died a long time ago, feeding destructive patterns of behavior only by their unwillingness to let go of the situation. Mental energy is like a powerful force field, which, being under reliable protection, creates an aura of confidence and dignity around the person. Entering a room, such a person does not need words to arouse respect. However, when this energy is wasted, the personality becomes vulnerable, reactive, and as if invisible to others. The world is cruel to those who give up easily. Therefore, it is crucial to learn to recognize your own triggers, the very factors that make you react impulsively and lose your inner balance. These are the vulnerable points where energy leaks out, and they are the ones that need to be worked on. The goal is not to become insensitive or indifferent, but to learn to be selective and to gain full control over oneself, becoming the master of one's own destiny. In the works of Carl Jung can be found truly revolutionary ideas, one of which states that by preserving personal energy, a person gets rid of the projections that he is endowed by others. This process can make people uncomfortable because it touches on an area of hidden manipulation. What follows is a discussion of how unscrupulous individuals use other people's energy for their own purposes and why remaining unavailable is an effective way to resist such manipulation. The reader is invited to face those who may have been unknowingly draining their resources. Many people believe they are in complete control of their emotions and reactions, but in reality, most emotional reactions are conditioned by predetermined programs, making the individual vulnerable to manipulation. Skilled manipulators do not resort to overt pressure, threats, or violence. Instead, they skillfully push buttons that the person has given themselves access to, eliciting predictable reactions. Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection, describing it as a psychological mechanism by which people transfer onto others qualities and aspects that they do not realize or accept in themselves. However, there is a subtle aspect to this phenomenon. When others project their expectations and perceptions, the person becomes a kind of vessel for these images. The greater the emotional openness, the more he becomes a blank canvas for other people's projections. Think of the friend who appears only in moments of personal crisis, or the partner who constantly needs rescuing, or the person who praises only as long as there is benefit. All these are not random coincidences. The interaction is not with the person, but with the representation of her, with the role she agrees to fulfill. But why does this consent arise? The root lies in the fear of disappointment, in the fear of losing love and being rejected. The most effective manipulation is manifested not in shouts and reproaches, but in the silence of guilt when a person feels obliged to another, when convinced of the need to be always available, to help and understand, even if it destroys him from the inside. It is important to realize that a manipulator does not need total control. He only needs to maintain a habitual reaction. When an individual ceases to meet the expectations of others, the habitual play of relationships is disrupted. The refusal to communicate, whether through silence or detachment, causes the illusions that others have created around him or her to be shattered. The mask they have placed on the person falls away, leaving them in a state of confusion as the familiar image of the person disappears. Moreover, they are forced to take a deep look inside themselves, which can be a painful experience they are not prepared for. Inaccessibility becomes a threat, forcing others to face their own inner emptiness. The silence offered by the individual exposes the inner chaos they choose to ignore. The result is aggression, criticism, and emotional outbursts caused not by the individual's mistakes, but by their refusal to be a convenient mirror reflecting their own perceptions. As Jung observed, enlightenment comes not through the contemplation of light, but through the realization of darkness. When the individual detaches and stops maintaining the vicious cycle, the shadow of the other person begins to manifest, which becomes unbearable for those who are used to using it as a way to escape reality. But what happens to the individual himself at this point? How willing is the individual to face the unpleasant consequences, such as misunderstanding, rejection, or even aggression, that arise when defending one's own interests? Does he or she have the resilience to endure the period of silence that inevitably follows the end of a relationship or conflict? It is in this silence, paradoxically, that a new form of inner strength emerges, as will be discussed below. The reader will be able to realize why silence can be the most powerful and destructive weapon affecting the human psyche, and how it fundamentally changes the interaction of the individual with the world around him. In today's world, full of noise and information overload, everyone wants to be heard, to react instantly to any event, to win meaningless arguments, and to defend their point of view, even if it harms their own mental balance. However, there is a special power that few people know about, and even fewer people know how to use it: the power of silence. It is not a silence dictated by passivity or cowardice, but a conscious, strategic, and clear silence, which is not the absence of something, but rather an intensified presence. The ancient sages viewed silence not as a void, but as fertile ground that promotes inner transformation. When a person stops reacting impulsively to external stimuli, he becomes able to observe. In the process of observation, he begins to notice patterns that had previously escaped his attention: repetitive emotional reactions, manipulative strategies, cycles of self-destructive behavior. Immersing oneself in silence offers the prospect of crystal clarity, but this clarity can be a threat to those who seek to manipulate and control others. Surely everyone has observed how some individuals experience panic attacks when their interlocutor evades, fails to provide explanations, or simply disappears from view. The true reason for such a reaction lies not in the longing for a particular person, but in the fact that his silence deprives the controller of the ability to manage the situation and impose his will. As long as a person is involved in dialogue and shares information, he remains within the established rules of the game. However, when he chooses silence, there is a paradigm shift, which inevitably throws those who are used to feeding off his reactions and emotions out of balance. True silence is not just the absence of sound, but the art of mastering one's own energy, the ability not to succumb to the emotional manipulations of others, and the conscious refusal to engage in meaningless conflicts that only drain one's inner resources. Carl Jung argued that the process of individuation, that is, becoming oneself, requires a certain distance from the outside world, because only in silence can one hear one's inner voice, which is not drowned out by the noise of external influences. However, it is worth remembering that silence comes at a price. It alienates from people who valued a person only for the role he played in their lives. Silence makes him incomprehensible to those who are accustomed to see in him only a reflection of their own projections. In the eyes of others, he can appear cold, aloof, and even arrogant. Such behavior, this is usually the response of those who have never sought to understand the inner world of the person and saw in it only a source of benefit. The harsh reality is this: as a person grows older, he becomes more discerning in his statements, realizing that every word is an investment of energy, and not everyone is worthy of being privy to his true beliefs. In some situations, silence is not a sign of weakness, but an assertion of independence and power, a way of communication of mature people who do not feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Silence can cause discomfort because it forces the interlocutor to face his own thoughts and internal contradictions, and this discomfort says much more about him than any arguments. There is no need to explain one's absence. It speaks for itself, and those who feel threatened by it demonstrate their dependence on another's imbalance, which they have used to maintain their own control. The most powerful silence, however, is not the one that causes others concern, but the one that restores a person's inner harmony, connecting them to something beyond external approval and recognition. It is in the secluded inner world, where insistent voices from outside are not heard, that the process of healing and restoration of vitality begins, that the long-awaited reunion with oneself takes place. The next part of the story will be devoted to this most important aspect, because it is not enough just to shield oneself from external noise. One must relearn to consciously manage one's energy, to carefully choose the directions for its application, the places where it should remain, and most importantly, the areas where it should not leak. It is time to become a real strategist of your own soul. For those who are on the path of restoring energy and establishing personal boundaries, a real treasure trove of knowledge will be the book Beyond the Shadow. It painstakingly dissects Jung's key ideas and offers actionable tools for protecting your energy, building boundaries, and reconnecting with your authentic self. A link to this life-changing book is in the pinned comment. However, it is worth remembering that theoretical knowledge alone is not enough. It is pointless to grasp all these truths at the level of intellect if in real life one continues to say yes when one's inner voice shouts no, to respond to messages that cause only anxiety, to waste time on meaningless conversations, and to maintain relationships that have long since exhausted themselves and exist only by inertia. Mere awareness without backing it up with action becomes a sophisticated form of self-deception. True personal transformation begins with a firm decision to become selective in one's reactions and interactions, which in turn requires considerable emotional self-discipline. Consciously limiting one's availability is not a manifestation of coldness, arrogance, or indifference. Rather, it is a conscious choice to stop being constantly available to anyone and everyone, regardless of circumstances. It is the ability to manage one's own energy, to use time rationally, and to protect one's mental balance. This process starts with small steps, not responding to messages immediately, taking a deep breath before responding to a situation, walking away from a discussion before it becomes chaotic, turning off the phone without feeling guilty, saying, "Not today," "I'm not interested," or "I won't get involved." The key point is that there is no need to justify one's absence or explain silence. A person owes nothing to anyone but himself. For many, this position seems unacceptable because refusing to explain removes the ability of others to keep the person emotionally dependent, where they should always be helpful, understanding, and available. The Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher Carl Jung was deeply aware that the path of individuation, the process of becoming a whole person, inevitably passes through a period of seclusion. However, this is not the kind of isolation that plunges one into the abyss of depression, but rather a sacred hermitage, a time for deep introspection and rethinking. During this period, a person learns anew to listen to his inner voice, which is not drowned out by the noise of the outside world. He rebuilds his identity, relying not on the fleeting glances of others, but on the solid foundation of his own I. There is an unmistakable indicator of personal growth, observing those who begin to distance themselves from a person as they become more reserved and self-centered. Attention should be paid to those who try to throw him off balance when he stops reacting violently to provocation. It is important to see those who accuse him of changing when he finally begins to assert his boundaries and protect his interests. All of these are not signs of a wrong path, but sure evidence of the beginning of liberation from other people's influence. At first, the state of inaccessibility may cause discomfort. A person may feel guilt, consider himself selfish, hear reproaches in excessive harshness. However, this is an integral part of the deconstruction process, the breaking down of old, limiting beliefs. After all, for many years, people have been taught to put their needs and desires last, submitting to the will of others. Of course, any change brings a certain discomfort, affecting not only the person who initiated it, but also those who are used to enjoying the benefits of the old order. Consciously limiting access to oneself becomes the foundation for self-determination. By saying a decisive no to the world around them, the individual affirms his or her yes to his or her own needs and values. By withdrawing from the poisonous atmosphere, a person demonstrates that his or her mental balance is far more valuable than any false ties. By ceasing to justify and explain his actions, he earns respect, even if only from a few. However, not everyone is ready to accept such a position. Emotional inaccessibility exposes other people's emotional wounds, which many prefer not to face. It highlights how much some people have depended on other people's emotional turmoil to feel the illusion of control over their own lives. It is at this point that a breakup occurs, accompanied by painful feelings of loneliness, alienation, and a sense of loss. But it is not really a loss, but a release from unnecessary burdens. But what lies ahead? What comes after the period of distancing? What is born out of silence and stillness? The final part of the narrative is devoted to rebirth, which becomes possible only when one has the courage to be misunderstood, to be alone with oneself, and to find wholeness. It is time to realize that the seclusion chosen by strong-willed individuals is the road to true independence. When a person ceases to be easily accessible to everyone and everything, deep processes of self-discovery are triggered. At first, there comes a silence, oppressive and unaccustomed, as if crying out from within. Doubts arise about the correctness of the decision taken. Whether a person is not too strict to those around him, whether he does not repel those who are close to him. However, gradually this silence transforms, acquiring a cleansing, soothing, and healing effect. Then comes loneliness, but it is not the dreary loneliness of abandonment, but a state of absolute self-sufficiency and presence in the moment. It is the solitude of the strong in spirit, of those who are no longer willing to betray their own principles for the sake of keeping other people around. In this liberated space, where confusion and chaos once reigned, clarity reigns, anxiety is replaced by peace, and the need for external approval is replaced by a new strength, the ability to experience inner wholeness. As Carl Jung argued, the process of individuation, that is, becoming oneself, involves distancing oneself from the collective consciousness. This is necessary in order to get rid of the masks imposed by society and for some time to pass one's way in solitude. When a person consciously chooses the path of inaccessibility, it is not an escape from the realities of life, but rather a return to the roots of his or her I. At this turning point, the individual ceases to be a passive object of external influences, becoming an active creator of his or her own destiny. It is no longer circumstances that dictate conditions, but an inner force that shapes the surrounding reality. People who are uncomfortable with this absence unwittingly demonstrate that they were attracted not by the person, but by the role they played. When the person goes beyond the usual role, they are confused, not knowing how to react. But this is liberation. Yes, there are inevitable losses in the circle of socialization, but in return you gain your own I. There is a distancing from certain places, but at the same time a reconnection with the deepest essence. Inevitably, misunderstanding on the part of others, but comes and long-awaited respect. After all, when a person ceases to be an easy prey, he becomes valuable, rare, and unforgettable. Do not be mistaken, this is a real rebirth, a new chapter in life. It begins a period when a person no longer trades on emotional handouts, psychological manipulation, and empty promises disguised as affection. From now on, only that which is in harmony with inner peace, truth, and integrity is accepted. If the reader has delved into these lines, it means that a readiness for change is already maturing in his soul. Underneath, he realizes that the recognition and love of others lose their value when you have to sacrifice your own essence to gain them. True self-love blossoms when a person puts his or her own interests first, even if this entails temporary loneliness. A legitimate question arises: is he or she willing to face misunderstanding, rejection, or even hatred in order to find inner freedom? Is he ready to pay the price that the right to be himself demands? If these words resonate in his heart, if he feels their meaning, let him share it in the comments by writing, "I choose my peace." It's interesting to see how many people are willing to embark on this path of change, and of course, don't stop there. The next video carries something important, perhaps even more meaningful than he can imagine. See you.